Hi, friends. Welcome to Mondays with Michelle, a sanctuary where we unite to inspire hope and peace through engaging discussions about mental health, relationships, and parenting. I'm Michelle, your guide through the sanctuary. I'm a mental health therapist with over 14 years of experience, an aspiring author currently quarrying agents, a peacemaker, and an advocate for those without a voice. Today, we will be discussing violence, including trauma as a risk factor. On that note, there is a content warning. This article explores themes of abuse, trauma, and mass shootings. Please read with caution or listen with caution and consider your well being. If you are experiencing suicidal or homicidal thoughts, please call 988. On that note, let's begin. Since we're discussing a heavy topic today, I pulled out mindfulness cards for when you feel bad. And the card that I chose, there is a front and a back. On the front, there's a saying, and then on the back is an exercise that we'll do briefly together. So the front says, connection is where your attention is. Often, our attention is directed out at others, what we do, events. Occasionally, direct your attention to yourself and ask, how are you really? So that's a good opportunity to check in with yourself, and the gentle exercise on the back will do that a little bit further. So close your eyes. We can take a deep inhalation and exhale. Then one body part at a time. Ask, how are you? Begin at your toes and at a comfortable pace, make your way up. All the way to the top of your head. When you ask, how are you? Listen to what your body answers. How does your body communicate to you? Do you hear your body's messages? Okay, go ahead and open your eyes, and we'll get started knowing that you can pause or take a break at any point in time. And it's important to continue to check in with yourself throughout this process, since we are talking about some heavy things today. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So the recent violence in America, I live in the United States, it definitely made me want to address this topic. It started after the representatives in Minnesota, the Hortmans and the Hoffmans, experienced political gun violence in their homes. And then it was also exacerbated by the school shooting in Minnesota. So that's when I really wanted to start exploring this topic a little bit more deeply. To kind of get messages out that maybe aren't presented by mainstream media. A lot of mainstream media, no offense to any of those people, but they tend to portray things in a way that's divisive instead of practical ways that can really bring people together. Since I made the decision that this was something that I wanted to explore. Actually, one of the days I had started working on writing it, there was additional violence in America with the shooting of Charlie Kirk and then also the school shooting in Colorado. So that just reinforced to me the importance of professionals, especially mental health professionals, to start speaking out and addressing this difficult, challenging topic in a way that hopefully will bring people together instead of perpetuating continued divisiveness and continued violence. It's time we break the cycle. It's time that we do some things differently as a society. And I think mental health professionals play a significant role in being able to do that, to be able to guide people in a unified direction. So since that day that I started working on it, obviously there's been more violence. The very next day after those shootings, we remembered the violence that occurred in on 9/11. I think most people remember where they were at if they were alive when that incident happened and can remember exactly how that day unfolded. Um, it was a pretty traumatic experience for most of us living here in the United States, even if we weren't in New York City or some of the other areas that were impacted. And since then, there were the shootings at the ICE detention center in Texas. And then over the weekend, there was also the shooting at the Mormon church in Michigan. So, again, all of this continued violence is more and more evidence that we need to intervene. That time is now. That time is not 5 years from now. It is not 10 years from now or 50 years from now. The time to intervene is right now at this moment. So, this will be a series of articles and podcasts. I can't tell you exactly when the next one will be coming or what schedule it's going to be on, but I can tell you there's a lot of information out there, a lot of research that isn't necessarily discussed that I'm kind of sifting through to be able to put together in a coherent manner to be able to share that with you. So today, as I said, we're going to start by discussing the experiences of trauma as a risk factor for violence. So we're going to start by talking about what is violence. So violence comes in many forms. To be clear, there is not a safe or acceptable form of violence. All violence is unacceptable and it is not excusable. So, some of those different categories are things like physical abuse, domestic violence, sexual abuse, emotional and psychological abuse, neglect, gun violence, political violence, and terrorism and war. Um, so, all of those forms of violence can result in what we call trauma. Very briefly, there's what we refer to as big T trauma, and then there's what we refer to as small t trauma. So, big T trauma or capital T is the things like I just discussed. It tends to be interpersonal in nature, which means it's one person acting violently towards another person. So, those are experiences of big T trauma. And then the little t forms of trauma, they're still trauma. They're just not as necessarily detrimental or harmful as the big T trauma. They may not result in long term chronic PTSD, for example. They still are important to discuss and address, especially with a mental health professional if you need to. But we're not going to necessarily be addressing the little t forms of trauma today. What those are, like I said, they tend to be, they're not interpersonal in nature. They tend to be one time sort of events like a car accident, a storm that goes through that maybe down some tree branches that was scary. Maybe it caused some damage, like a tree branch fell on your car or something like that, but it didn't cause significant harm or damage to like human beings. So those things are more like the little t traumas. Again, still important, but we're not focusing on them today. So, as far as connecting the role of trauma as a risk factor of violence, there are some statistics that 70% of individuals who perpetrated school mass shootings experienced some form of childhood trauma. Parental violence is one of the largest risk factors as far as even childhood trauma goes. So that can be things like psychological, physical, or sexual violence by parents, or witnessing domestic violence between parents or parent figures in the household. So, why does experience violence or even witnessing domestic violence, how is that connected to individuals choosing to engage in their own form of violence as adults? So, to start to understand that connection and that relationship, we can look to social learning theory. That began with the Bobo doll experiment that was conducted by Albert Bandura. Basically, through that classic experiment, children were in a room with a Bobo doll, and the children who witnessed an adult come into the room and essentially assault the Bobo doll, the kids who witnessed that were more likely then to engage in aggression towards the Bobo doll once the adult left the room. So that opened the door to be able to understand that process and why that happened a little bit more. Why kids who witness violence are more likely to engage in violent behaviors themselves. So, part of social learning theory that was developed explains that process of what happens. Essentially, there are four components. The first one is attention. The kid has to like pay attention to what was going on. Then there's retention, where it's encoded into our memories. Reproduction, where we act out what we saw. And then there also has to be some continued motivation. Like there has to be a reason to continue those behaviors. So, as far as witnessing domestic violence or experiencing trauma in the home, especially by parents, so with attention, when there is violence going on in your own home, the children who have directly experienced that violence or witnessed the violence in their household, they don't really have a choice but to pay attention to it because it's part of their daily reality. You know, it's happening in their home, it's happening around them. They may wake up to the act of violence that's occurring around them. So they don't really have a choice since it's happening in their own home. And then retention, any of those memories that they went through, those experiences they went through, they are encoded into their memories. For the most part, almost everything that we experience does, in one way or another, get encoded into our memory. Especially short term memory, and then later on, it's put in long term memory. And those types of traumatic experiences, high stress experiences, they tend to even be encoded in memory at a higher rate than other sort of memories. So it definitely has that retention piece. So then reproduction would happen. Children often recreate these experiences during their play and also during interactions with peers, friends, on the playground, and then also even with adults. So, as a mental health therapist, when I worked with children, we refer to that as trauma reenactment when they act out what they witnessed in their play. It would be similar to Bandura's study where he observed the children who witnessed violence then were violent towards the Bobo doll. So the kids would act out what they experienced through aggression towards the items during play therapy. And that can happen at home too, not just in a therapeutic setting. And like I said, even schools may see some of the behavior, other parents in the neighborhood may see some of the behavior because those children may be violent and aggressive towards their own children or other children on the playground. So the motivation piece is interesting. So a lot of people in society are able to break the cycle. Just because you experience trauma does not mean you're going to become a violent person in adulthood. There are lots of ways for motivation to have safe, healthy, considerate behaviors instead of going down the path of violent behaviors. So when people choose or act out those continued aggressive or violent behaviors, there's some motivation there to do so. One of our ongoing series, one of the articles will really focus on motivation. I won't give necessarily any spoiler alerts, but I definitely found it very interesting, disturbing, but also interesting on what can motivate people for those behaviors to continue and even escalate over time. In a nutshell, the behavior is reinforced through feelings of pride, a sense of accomplishment, and even satisfaction from exerting power over others. So, like I said, future articles are going to explore more reinforcers and that motivation for aggressive acts. I guess there is a little bit of a spoiler alert. It'll look at the relationship between exclusion and radicalization. And then the series is also going to look at mental health factors that can be involved that impact and influence gun violence. We'll look at the importance of having healthy relationships and a sense of community in a healthy level, in a healthy way, and the importance of policy development and the implementation to be able to break the cycle of violence. So there are definitely unified ways that we can come together to implement common sense policies to be able to address the cycle of violence that's going on in our society. All right, so our activity for today will be exploring your own ACE score. So, what ACEs are, they stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And there's a quick quiz. I put a link to the quiz in the podcast article. So you go to that website and then you click to learn your number, and it'll run you through a series of questions that you answer yes or no based on whether or not you experience those events prior to your 18th birthday. So again, it's adverse childhood experiences. So it's really looking at what happened to you during your childhood. Trauma during adulthood also increases the likelihood of violence towards other people, but the ACEs only focus on what happened during childhood because that's really one of the biggest indicators, and it really affects us because they occur while we're developing. Our brains are learning and growing, our bodies are maturing, and so what happens to us during our childhood can have an impact, a significant impact on who we are and how we respond in adulthood. So that's our activity, is learn your ACE score. And then as far as our intention goes, this past week, I just did a mini course on stress management techniques. You can go back and review those if you happen to miss them. But I just want to reinforce, especially when we're talking about such heavy topics and we see it so regularly and consistently on the news, that in of itself impacts us. So I want to reinforce, implement some stress management techniques into your life this week. Again, last week, every day, I shared some stress management techniques, way to handle all of the stress, all of the weight, the burden of everything that happens to us in life. So, again, review those and implement something, at least one thing, into your life this week. So, as far as our weekly reflection, take a few moments to pause and reflect on the emotions that surfaced for you in response to this disturbing acts of violence that unfolded. You might find yourself grappling with a complex mix of feelings related to the events themselves, as well as the perpetuation of political division that continues to permeate our society. Consider the various reactions you observed in others and the experience of violence worldwide. Journal about the impact these events had on you this week. Consider who you can reach out to for the comfort and support you may need during this time. Reaching out to someone who understands can help you process these feelings, which promotes healing. So, even again, if these events didn't directly impact you, they still impact us as a society as a whole because we're learning about them, we're seeing things on the news. Some things have fairly disturbing videos that have presented themselves on the internet. If at all possible, do not watch those videos because that in of itself can cause trauma. So if you see those types of videos in which a significant act of violence was actively taking place against another human being, don't watch that. We don't need the consequences and further trauma than is already happening. We learned that after 9/11, when an entire country watched on TV the act of violence that was perpetuated or perpetrated in New York City. What researchers and clinicians found, which was interesting, was people across the country were experiencing symptoms of PTSD, and at that time they didn't know why. And so, through additional research, we learned that just witnessing traumatic events, even if it's on a television screen, can actually cause trauma. So, if one of those extremely violent videos shows up on your phone, on your social media, please intentionally do not click on it, even if you may kind of feel interested in it or want to see it. Resist that urge for your own well-being and mental health. So Again, even just hearing about, seeing this stuff on the news, feeling the feelings, it creates a reaction in us. So it's definitely okay to reach out to your friends, just have a conversation, get some support. Even if you don't talk about that, just spend some time with your friends, be part of your community. And again, you can journal about those types of things. Any form of creativity can help us to be able to express and process what happened. All right. Well, if you have any questions about this podcast, Breaking the Cycle, go ahead and put those in the comments. Since this is an ongoing series, some of your questions may be answered in future articles. So I may just let you know that I'll address this later on and to keep an eye out for those articles. But for the time being, if you have any questions about the relationship between people who experience trauma and violence, put those in the comments. And then next week, we're going to be talking about the shadow. All right. Well, thank you for being here. I appreciate you. Please let me know if there's anything I can do to assist you. Otherwise, I will chat with you next Monday. Thank you so much.